A pastor vanished without a trace. 25 years later, a shocking secret was found beneath the tree. A black pastor from the mountain town of Ashford, North Carolina, vanished without a trace, leaving the religious community with only vague speculations about what had happened. But 25 years later, his son Daniel received a call from Detective Rachel Carter, informing him about a duffel bag buried beneath a tree containing a preacher's robe and a Bible with his father's name inside. It was barely past 5 on a fog-wrapped Friday morning in the sleepy mountain town of Ashford, North Carolina, nestled deep within the shadowy ridges of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The light hadn't yet broken through the gray mist crawling across the pine trees, and in a narrow third-floor apartment above a silent post office, Daniel Bennett, 42, sat slouched on his worn couch, remote in hand, flipping through early morning infomercials that blurred together like static. He didn't really watch them. The TV was more of a white noise machine, a distraction from the kind of thoughts that crept in when everything else was quiet. Today was a terrible anniversary. It had been exactly 25 years since his father, Reverend Thomas Bennett, had vanished. One day, the most respected black preacher in all of Ashford, faithful beloved, never missed a sermon, simply disappeared without a trace. No car, no note, no body, only questions and silence. Daniel had been just 17, then full of promise, faith, and fire. But that morning changed him. He remembered the chaos, the church crying, the cops shrugging, the whispers that maybe his father had snapped under pressure, maybe run off, maybe worse. Even now, a quarter of a century later, the weight of not knowing clung to his chest like a stone. He kept flipping channels, and then it happened. He landed on a local religious broadcast, an old rerun. A preacher's voice rose, echoing through the screen. The man was standing at a pulpit with stained glass light pouring behind him. He preached about grace, suffering, justice. Daniel froze. The cadence of the voice, the rhythm, the echo of a man long gone. For a second, it was like hearing his father again. Daniel stared at the screen, heart pounding. The ache returned deeper than he'd felt in years. He lowered the volume, and then the phone rang. He jumped. Who would be calling this early? He picked up. "Hello, Mr. Bennett," a calm female voice asked. "Yes, this is Detective Rachel Carter with the Ashford County Sheriff's Department. I know it's early, but something came up. We believe it may be connected to your father's case." The remote slipped from Daniel's fingers and hit the floor. "Is this a joke?" he asked, voice dry. "That case is dead, like everyone's hope." "I understand your skepticism, Mr. Bennett," she replied gently. "But this is real. About an hour ago, a logging crew found a buried duffel bag in the forest off Red Hollow Trail Road. Inside it were a vintage preacher's robe and a Bible. The name Thomas Bennett was handwritten inside the front cover." Daniel's breath hitched. "What? What kind of bag?" "An old Adidas gym bag. Water damaged but intact. We'd like you to come verify the items. I've dispatched an officer to pick you up." The call ended. For a moment, Daniel couldn't move. That name, his father's, pulled him back 25 years in an instant. In an Adidas bag, his father had always worn second-hand suits and carried a leather-bound briefcase. He would never own something like that. It felt wrong, out of place. But the ache was now replaced with something else, a pulse. Something was waking up inside him. Not quite hope, not quite fear. Maybe both. Within 30 minutes, Daniel stood outside his apartment as a sheriff's cruiser pulled up. He turned off his phone, grabbed a jacket, and slid into the back seat, saying nothing, as the car pulled away from the town's quiet center and headed into the dense woods. The drive was tense and silent. Trees lined the roadside like silent judges. The further they drove, the less Daniel recognized. Even though he had lived in Ashford all his life, he'd never gone this far out. The cruiser pulled up to a clearing marked with yellow police tape. Several officers were already there. A towering pine stump had been dug around, revealing a half-rotted cavity beneath. Mr. Bennett, a woman in a blazer, stepped forward. She had steel gray hair pulled back and a badge clipped to her hip. "I'm Detective Carter. Thank you for coming on such short notice. This is Earl Hopkins, the logger who found the bag." A gruff man with calloused hands stepped up. "Sorry it's under such circumstances," he said, shaking Daniel's hand. "What exactly did you find?" Daniel asked, his voice flat. "I was clearing fallen trees with my crew when I noticed this stump had been hollowed out underneath." Earl explained. I figured maybe animals or something, but when I dug a little, I hit canvas. Pulled it out, saw the robe and Bible. I knew right away something wasn't right. The officers led Daniel to a folding table under a tent. On it lay a sealed evidence bag. Inside was a mold-stained black Bible and a long cream-colored robe. Daniel's knees weakened. That robe, it looked just like the one his father used to wear when giving sermons at Cedar Hill Baptist Church. And then he saw it inside the Bible in the corner of the front page, the unmistakable handwriting of his father, Thomas A. Bennett Pamam. That's his, Daniel whispered. That's his handwriting. An officer gently flipped to the back page. Tucked between the last pages was a loose slip of paper, a personal prayer, but not the usual kind. Daniel read it aloud, voice trembling. Lord, why does evil sit beside righteousness in your house? Help me to remain strong, for they want to pull me away from you. The serpent wears a collar. Give me courage. The last line hit him like a punch. The serpent wears a collar. What did that mean? Daniel looked up at Detective Carter. You think he wrote this before he disappeared? She nodded. We believe so, and there's no sign of blood or foul play on the items. But we're sending them for DNA testing. It's the best chance we have now. Daniel stared at the bag. Something didn't sit right. Detective, he said slowly. My father would never use a flashy gym bag like that. He was old-fashioned, reserved. So someone else may have packed the bag, she asked. He nodded and buried it, far off in the woods, under a rotted stump. He paused. That's not something a man does for himself. She looked at him carefully. Do you think someone killed your father, Mr. Bennett? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked if he wanted to disappear. Why leave behind evidence at all? Why bury a bag instead of just vanishing? Detective Carter gave him a long, unreadable look. That's what we want to find out. Back at home hours later, Daniel stood in his spare room, a makeshift shrine to the man he had lost. His father's old study rebuilt in fragments. Sermon notes, framed photos, theological books. Everything was here except one thing. The year 1977 was missing. No notebook, no journal, no sermons from the very year his father vanished. He had all the others, meticulously preserved, dusty but intact, but nothing from that year. Daniel's mind was spinning. What if someone had taken it? What if the missing notebook held the answer to his father's disappearance? He reached for his coat again. He was going back to Cedar Hill Baptist Church for the first time in 25 years. If your father left behind a trail of handwritten truth, but the most important year had been ripped away, would you dare go back to where it all began? Daniel Bennett sat in the quiet of his apartment, surrounded by shelves that once gave him comfort. His father's study materials, old sermon books, worn-out Bible's notes in neat black ink, were all carefully organized like relics. Every page in this room carried his father's voice, his thoughts, his unwavering conviction. But now all Daniel could feel was a tremor in his gut. He had started pulling the volumes out one by one. Sermons, personal devotions. His father, Reverend Thomas Bennett, had been obsessive about recording everything. Daniel had every year from his father's ministry neatly filed, until he didn't. 1977 was missing, the year his father disappeared. He froze. He went through the shelves again, checked behind books, opened every cabinet and drawer. Still nothing. Then he turned to the diaries, thin leather-bound journals that sat stacked in a narrow box by the window. His father had written in them religiously, 1971, 1972, 1973, 1976. No, 1977. Not a scrap, not a word. The silence inside Daniel's apartment suddenly felt too loud. His chest rose and fell faster, like the air was thinning around him. His father never missed a year, never misplaced his words. They were sacred to him. So how could both the sermon notebook and the personal diary for the year he vanished be gone, not damaged, not misplaced, erased? Daniel sat down hard on the floor, surrounded by the past, yet somehow further from his father than he'd ever felt. A whisper rose in the back of his mind. What if someone didn't want you to read what he wrote that year? He thought about the prayer found inside the Bible that was unearthed in the forest. The serpent wears a collar. Suddenly a chill ran through him. That wasn't a metaphor. It was a warning. He stood brushing dust off his jeans and stared at the blank space on the shelf where the 1977 notebook should have been. He knew where his father spent most of his time that year, Cedar Hill Baptist Church, the place he had avoided for more than 2 decades. Daniel had tried to bury it along with his rage, his loss, his faith, but now the silence had become unbearable. The truth was pressing at the walls. He grabbed the notebook from 1976, his only bridge to the missing year, and walked out the door. Driving back towards Cedar Hill felt like crossing into another lifetime. The church had been both a home and a furnace for his childhood, a place of miracles, of music, of Sunday laughter and midweek prayers. Now it loomed like a cathedral of secrets. The parking lot was nearly empty. The white columns, once proud and welcoming, were dulled by time. The letters on the old wooden sign out front were faded. "The truth shall set you free." Daniel got out of the car and walked slowly to the front door. His hand hovered at the handle for a second too long. Then he pushed it open. The smell hit him, first lemon polish and age. It was like stepping into a dream made of wood and memory. Everything looked the same. The polished pews, the stained glass light streaming across the aisle, the echoes. Daniel took slow steps down the center aisle, his eyes drawn to the pulpit where his father once stood, with fire in his voice. From the corner of the sanctuary, a voice called out, "Can I help you?" Daniel turned. An elderly man stepped forward, trim white hair, gentle eyes. "Pastor William Granger," the man introduced himself. Then after a pause, Daniel nodded. A pause hung between them like a held breath. "It's been, 25 years, Granger said softly. "Since my father disappeared," Daniel replied. Another figure entered from the hallway, taller, heavier, with a slight limp and a cane. "Reverend Charles Whitaker Granger," said, nodding at the second man. "He served with your father as well." Whitaker looked Daniel over carefully. "Didn't think we'd see you again." "I didn't either," Daniel said. "But something's come up." He explained what the sheriff had told him. The buried bag, the robe, the Bible, the note, the name in his father's handwriting. The silence from the 2 pastors was deafening. "I came back because I'm looking for something," Daniel said. "My father's sermon notebook from 1977 and his personal diary, they're gone. The only year missing." He held up the 1976 notebook. He kept these his entire life. Every sermon, every prayer. And suddenly, 1977 is gone. Granger and Whitaker exchanged a glance. "We haven't seen anything like that," Whitaker said. "If they're here, we'll help you find them," Granger added. Daniel didn't speak. He just gestured toward the hall. The office that used to belong to Reverend Thomas Bennett was now Reverend Whitaker's. It felt colder than Daniel remembered. He started searching, quietly, methodically, drawer after drawer, shelf after shelf, under rugs, behind picture frames. Nothing. He turned toward Whitaker. "May I check the church library?" Granger nodded, of course. The library smelled of old Bibles and dust. Afternoon light filtered through narrow windows. Daniel walked in first, clutching the 1976 notebook. He placed it on a reading table. Then he began scanning the shelves. There were dozens of church records, ledgers, hymnals, old annual reports, but nothing that matched his father's notebooks. No journal labeled 1977, no sermon notes. He opened filing drawers, peeked inside storage boxes, carefully checked the backs of shelves. Whitaker leaned on a shelf. Maybe he took it with him wherever he went. Daniel turned slowly. "My father never ran from anything." Whitaker said nothing. Granger offered a soft smile. "Even if we don't find anything, you were right to come back." Daniel didn't respond. He just stared at the blank space on the shelf like it might give up its secret if he watched long enough. They left the library together. Daniel walked out of the church alone. The autumn breeze had picked up. Leaves swirled across the parking lot like whispers. His hands were empty, but his mind was burning. What had started as mourning was quickly turning into suspicion. And the deeper he went, the more it felt like someone didn't want the truth to be found. Someone who might have once called his father brother. As Daniel drove away from Cedar Hill, he didn't notice the notebook he left behind on the library table. He didn't see the shadowy figure who returned to the sanctuary minutes later, and he didn't know yet what the missing pages would eventually reveal. But he would soon, because faith once cracked open doesn't just die, it hunts. If you believe Reverend Thomas Bennett left behind more than just sermons, comment 100 and tell us what country you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and tag someone who loves a story where truth refuses to stay buried. Because in part 3, Daniel meets the boy who unknowingly holds the key. When Daniel Bennett pulled back into the church parking lot that evening, the sky had dimmed into a soft lavender haze. He hadn't meant to return so soon. In fact, he hadn't planned to return at all until the sinking feeling hit him halfway home. He had left something behind, his father's 1976 sermon notebook, the one piece of evidence he still had in hand, the one link to the year that had disappeared. The front door of Cedar Hill Baptist Church creaked as he stepped in. The sanctuary was quiet, empty. A young staff member, maybe in his 20s, met him in the hallway. "You were here earlier, right?" the young man asked. Daniel nodded. "I left a notebook in the library." "Oh yeah, we saw it." "I'll take you." Inside the library, the table where Daniel had left the notebook was untouched. He exhaled in relief and stepped forward to retrieve it until something on the top shelf caught his eye. A large, thick book misaligned, not tucked in like the others, just enough to seem disturbed. He reached up and gently pulled it free. The title read Church Financial Management and Stewardship. It didn't seem important until he opened it. The margins were full of handwriting, but not just any handwriting. His father's. Neat, firm, familiar. There were notes about integrity, passages underlined about transparency and honesty with congregations, but then scribbled in pencil names. 2 of them, circled, then erased. William Granger, Charles Whitaker. Daniel's mouth went dry. He turned the page. One entry had been nearly scratched out, but he could still make out part of it. Missing funds now over $10,000. Approached both men. They denied it. "But I have the ledgers." Praying for a way to resolve without destroying the church. Daniel clutched the book tightly, heart-thudding. He turned back to the young staffer. "Can I borrow this?" The staffer hesitated. "We're not supposed to let books leave, but I guess it's your father's handwriting. I'll return it," Daniel promised. "Can I ask where are Pastors Granger and Whitaker?" "They're at the church cemetery," the young man said casually. "Performing blessings, I think." "Blessings?" Daniel frowned. At this hour, the staffer shrugged. "It's not unusual, I guess. I've only been here a year." Daniel thanked him and walked to the side exit. The cemetery sat on the far end of the property, beyond a small grove of trees. As he approached, the air turned cooler. Shadows deepened. Then he saw them. Pastor Granger and Reverend Whitaker standing near a mound of earth. Granger held a shovel. Whitaker was crouched beside a canvas bag. They didn't see him. Daniel stayed hidden among the trees, heart pounding. They weren't blessing graves, they were digging one up. He waited until the bag was halfway buried before stepping into the clearing. "Evening, gentlemen." Both men jerked around, startled. Their faces went pale in the dying light. Daniel Granger stammered, "What are you?" "I left my notebook," Daniel said evenly. "Figured I'd come back. Thought I'd say hello." He pointed to the shovel. "What are you burying?" Old Grave Whitaker said too quickly. "A dog. We were moving it." "A dog?" Daniel stared at them both. "That's your story." Silence. Then Daniel held up the financial book. "I found my father's notes. He knew. About the money. About you. You erased your names, but he pressed hard when he wrote. I can still read it." Whitaker's jaw clenched. "You think I'm just going to let this go?" Daniel continued, stepping forward. "That I won't find out what really happened in 1977. Before either man could speak, Daniel heard a sound behind him. A car. Detective Rachel Carter stepped out of an unmarked vehicle, followed by 2 officers. "We got your message," she said quietly to Daniel. "Thank you for not confronting them alone." Whitaker's face collapsed. Granger stepped back from the shovel, hands raised. Carter signaled the officers. "Secure the bag and dig deeper if necessary." Daniel watched as they uncovered what lay beneath. First a bundle of moldy fabric, then bone fragments, a human jaw, pieces of a robe barely intact. Carter turned to Daniel. "We'll need to do a full analysis, but it's likely your father." Daniel nodded slowly, eyes stinging. Granger began sobbing. Whitaker said nothing. Back at the station, Reverend Whitaker finally broke. Through hours of questioning, the truth spilled out. Reverend Thomas Bennett had confronted Granger and Whitaker in 1977 about embezzling church funds. He'd given them a choice: confess and step down, or he would bring the truth before the congregation. They panicked. That night, they met him in the church basement under the guise of a prayer meeting. An argument broke out, a scuffle. Then, in a moment of blind desperation, they attacked him. He died minutes later. They wrapped his body in a robe, buried it in an unmarked grave, originally used for a pet, and buried his diary and sermon book elsewhere, deep in the woods under a tree they knew had been cut years ago. They counted on the town forgetting. And for a while it did, until now. Weeks later, Daniel stood at his father's final resting place, this time marked by a real gravestone. The church had come out in droves. The community mourned the pastor they had lost, and now finally they knew the truth. Beside the grave knelt a boy, Eli, the child Daniel had met days earlier in the cemetery, the one who had reminded him of himself. He was holding a flower in one hand, a communion wafer in the other. Daniel stepped beside him. "You feeling better?" he asked. Eli nodded. "The doctor said I can go home next week. My aunt, she's different now. She cries a lot. I think she understands." Daniel smiled gently. "Sometimes it takes loss to wake people up." Eli looked up at him. "You still gonna go back to church?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Then yes, I think I will." They sat in silence, watching the wind stir the trees above the grave. That night, Daniel knelt in his apartment holding his father's last full notebook, the one from 1976. He prayed, really prayed, not to be angry, not to forget, but to understand and forgive. His father had died trying to protect the truth, but he had done it with grace, with love, and now finally Daniel could live that truth forward. If this story moved you, comment 200 and tell us where you're watching from. And don't forget to like, share, and tag someone who needs to know that truth always finds its way home. The morning sun pierced through the stained glass windows of Cedar Hill Baptist Church, splashing fractured light across the empty pews. But the warmth outside had not found its way inside Daniel Bennett. He sat alone in the third row, his hands clasped tightly around his father's sermon notebook from 1976. The echoes of Reverend Thomas Bennett's voice still lingered in Daniel's mind, woven through the words written in the margins, a pastor's doubts, fears, and an unwavering conviction. He hadn't slept. Not since reading those lines in the stewardship book the night before. Not since seeing Charles Whitaker and William Granger shoveling dirt over a bag at the edge of the cemetery. He knew the truth was unraveling like a seam ripped open after years of pressure. But he also knew something darker. The truth alone might not be enough. A light cough broke the silence. Daniel turned. Standing in the doorway was Eli, the boy he'd met days earlier. He held a plastic bag in one hand, swinging slightly, and a small envelope in the other. "You left this in the library," Eli said, walking down the aisle. "I saw you reading that big book with the old writing. Then you forgot this folder thing." Daniel reached for the envelope, surprised. Inside were photocopies pages from a much older ledger. 1977. "Where did you get these?" Eli looked hesitant. "My aunt works in the records office at the courthouse. I told her about you and your dad. She said she remembered something strange from years ago. Told me to give you this, but not tell anyone." Daniel scanned the pages. There were church deposit slips, all signed by Reverend Bennett until mid-June 1977. Then, nothing. After that, new slips appeared, but signed by Whitaker and Granger. Yet the amounts were inconsistent. Some funds were redirected to a community development initiative that had no registered permits. Up front, his pulse quickened. It was real. The theft, the cover-up, and maybe even the murder. Daniel didn't wait. He drove straight to the office of Detective Rachel Carter, her face growing grimmer with every page he showed her. "You have enough here to open an official investigation," she said. "The forged slips, the sudden shift in account control, the missing permit registry. But we'll need more to move on an arrest, especially for something that happened 25 years ago." Daniel leaned forward. "They were burying something in the cemetery last night. I saw them. Bones." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Why didn't you call me then?" "I wasn't ready to see him like that. I needed to be sure." She softened. We can file for an excavation order, but it might take a day or two. Be careful, Daniel. These men still hold power in this town. Not everyone will thank you for disturbing what they think is buried." He nodded slowly, gripping the edge of her desk. "I'm not doing this for thanks. I'm doing it for him." Back at the church, Daniel was no longer welcomed with quiet nods and nostalgic smiles. The air shifted. People looked away. Conversations stopped when he walked by. Rumors were spreading that the pastor's son had come back to destroy the church, that he was inventing lies, that he was unwell. But not everyone turned. That Sunday during a sparse service, a woman in her late 70s approached him after the final hymn. "You look like your father," she said. Her voice trembled. "Thank you," Daniel said softly. "Did you know him?" She nodded. "I cleaned the church floors for 20 years. I remember the week he vanished. He told me he was going to confront someone, said he'd found proof, but the next day the pulpit was empty. They told us he left town, that he snapped under pressure." She paused. "Well, but I never believed that." No, from her purse she pulled out a small worn cassette tape. "He asked me to hold on to this, said if anything ever happened to him, someone would come asking. It's his voice, a message." Daniel felt as though the breath had been punched out of his chest. He took the tape with shaking hands. That night he sat alone in the dark, the tape loaded into an old recorder, borrowed from the church's basement archives. Then came the voice. Thomas Bennett. Clear, resolute, unshaken. "If you're listening to this, something has gone wrong. I've made copies of everything. The financial ledgers, the meeting transcripts. I fear William and Charles are capable of things I never imagined. I've given the originals to someone I trust. If I disappear, they didn't act alone. Look deeper and tell my son, I never stopped believing in the truth." Daniel pressed pause, eyes wet. He sat there for a long time, gripping the edge of the desk. In that moment, his father wasn't just a memory, he was a witness. The next day, Daniel returned to Detective Carter with the tape. "This changes everything," she said. "We need to move now, tonight, before they bury more than evidence." As dust settled again over the Blue Ridge Mountains, a quiet storm brewed. Police units surrounded the church cemetery under cover of darkness. Rachel led the charge, Daniel close behind. Eli, who had insisted on coming, stood in the distance with his aunt watching from a hill. They found Whitaker and Granger near the same gravesite, this time trying to dig it back up, perhaps to move the body, or hide it deeper. Spotlights flickered on. "Put down the shovel." Both men froze. It was over. And yet for Daniel, it had just begun. The cold hum of the fluorescent lights in the Cedar County Police Department seemed louder than usual that morning. Detective Rachel Carter stood behind the two-way mirror, arms, crossed eyes locked on the interrogation room where William Granger sat silent and unblinking. His hands rested flat on the metal table, the same hands that had once blessed newborns and buried the dead. Now they trembled ever so slightly. Charles Whitaker was in a separate room down the hall, already lawyered up and refusing to speak. But Granger, the quieter of the two, the one who had always looked like guilt, wore heavy on his spine, was showing cracks. Rachel turned to Daniel Bennett, who stood beside her, fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. "He's close," she said. "We just need the right pressure." Daniel didn't blink. "Let me talk to him." Rachel hesitated. "Absolutely not. He's a suspect." "You're not trained. I'm not asking as a cop," Daniel cut in. "I'm asking as the son of the man they buried." There was a long pause, then Rachel nodded. Inside the interrogation room, William Granger looked up as Daniel entered. For a moment, the two men simply stared at each other, the silence stretching thick and suffocating. "You knew him," Daniel finally said, voice raw. "You worked beside him for years, prayed with him, ate at our table, and then you killed him." Granger flinched. "You don't know what you're saying." "I heard his voice," Daniel said, placing the cassette player on the table. "He trusted you, and you buried that trust with his body." Granger closed his eyes. A deep breath escaped him like air finally let out of a coffin. "It wasn't supposed to happen that way," he murmured. Daniel didn't speak. He let the silence demand the truth. Granger continued, voice cracking. "Your father discovered the fund transfers. He confronted Charles first. I didn't even know how deep it had gone until that night. I got a call from Charles, told me Tom had threatened to go public at Sunday service. Daniel's stomach twisted. We met him at the church late. We begged him to wait. Charles got angry, said Tom was about to ruin everything we'd built. He accused him of pride, said he'd destroy the congregation. Your father said we needed to come clean, that God wouldn't bless stolen grace. Granger's hands clenched into fists. Charles shoved him. He fell, hit his head on the pulpit base. There was blood, but he wasn't dead, just unconscious. I panicked. Charles told me we had to move him, get rid of him before morning, that no one would believe us if we claimed it was an accident. Daniel's voice was a whisper. So you buried him. Granger nodded, tears in his eyes, behind the cemetery. Said it was poetic, returning the shepherd to his flock. I hated it, but I was weak. And then, we just never talked about it again. The silence became easier. Rachel stepped into the room. She had heard everything. You understand this is a confession of manslaughter, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy, she said calmly. Granger didn't resist. I'll sign whatever you want. Daniel stared at him, emotion storming beneath the surface. Why didn't you ever tell me? You let me think my father abandoned me? Granger shook his head, voice shaking. Because I thought you'd never forgive me. Daniel turned to leave. At the door, he paused. You were right. That evening, a press conference was held outside Cedar Hill Baptist Church. The truth was laid bare before the town, the stolen funds, the cover-up, the accidental death that became a decades-long betrayal. Some in the crowd wept. Others stood in stunned silence. Daniel took the microphone. My father, Reverend Thomas Bennett, was not a man who ran from truth. He died defending it. For years, this town lived under a shadow of silence. But today, that shadow lifts. Justice is not just about punishment, it's about remembering, about reclaiming what was stolen. My father deserves that. We all do. The town council voted to restore Reverend Bennett's name to the church's Hall of Honor. A memorial service was scheduled for the following week. This time there would be no silence, only music, stories, and finally, closure. As Daniel stood in the churchyard, looking over the now uncovered grave of his father, he felt a strange mix of grief and peace. He hadn't brought his father back, but he had brought his truth forward, and that at last was something sacred. If your father had been buried in secrets for 25 years, would you have the strength to fight the entire town for justice? Share your thoughts in the comments. The morning sky over Cedar Hill was a soft watercolor of pinks and grays. A gentle breeze swayed the trees outside the churchyard, brushing against the fresh soil where Reverend Thomas Bennett's new headstone stood. For 25 years, that patch of earth had hidden a man's body, and along with it, the truth, the legacy, and the dignity of a family. But today it would hide nothing. Today it would bear witness. Daniel Bennett stood in the middle of the sanctuary, looking around at the pews where he once sat as a boy, feet barely reaching the floor, listening to his father's voice echo through the high rafters. He could almost hear it now, calm, steady, wrapped in warmth. Except this time, it was Daniel's turn to speak. The congregation had filled in slowly. Elderly women with pressed dresses and folded tissues. Men with hands worn by years of labor holding hymn books to their chests like shields. Young faces who had only heard stories of Thomas Bennett, now curious to see what legacy had survived a quarter-century of silence. And somewhere among them stood Detective Rachel Carter, arms at her side, not in uniform, but here as a friend, a witness, a believer. Daniel stepped up to the pulpit. He didn't have a written sermon, just a leather-bound Bible in one hand and his father's old church keys in the other. He paused, looking out across the room, his gaze lingering on the stained glass window behind the altar, its center pane newly replaced after years of quiet neglect. The image showed a shepherd kneeling beside a lamplight beaming from above. For the first time in decades, it felt honest. My father didn't leave Daniel, began his voice firm but gentle. He didn't walk out on this church. He didn't abandon his family. He didn't give up on God or on any of you. He was taken. And he was buried not just in soil, but in silence, in fear and in shame that didn't belong to him. The room was still, the only sound a sniffle from the third row. For 25 years, we allowed lies to shape our memory of a man who stood for truth. A man who stood up to corruption even when it meant standing alone. Some of you were here when he vanished. You were told to keep quiet, to move on. to let go. But no real healing ever comes from pretending nothing happened. Daniel looked down at the Bible in his hands, pages yellowed margins, scribbled with handwritten notes and circled verses. This Bible, he said, lifting it slightly, was found in the crawl space under our old home. It still smells like dust and old wood, but its words, they haven't faded. My father used to say, the truth doesn't rot, it waits. And I think he was right. He turned toward the headstone just outside the window. I spent most of my life chasing ghosts, trying to make peace with the fact that he never said goodbye. But now I know. He didn't have to. His life said everything it needed to. His death only amplified it. A quiet sob echoed near the back of the room. It was Eli, the old groundskeeper, who had given Daniel the recording. He sat with his hat in his lap, wringing it slowly, tears spilling freely down his cheeks. Daniel walked slowly down from the pulpit and stopped beside the small platform, holding his father's old Bible photo and the cassette tape that had shattered the silence. Some of you have asked what justice looks like after so many years. I used to think justice was handcuffs, confessions, trials, and prison walls. And yes, those things matter, but real justice is remembering. It's saying the name of someone you were told to forget. It's placing truth where lies once sat like royalty. He glanced toward the doors at the back of the sanctuary. Beyond them, the grave waited. The wind had picked up. It rustled the leaves outside like a quiet applause. That's why today, Daniel continued, we're not just burying a body, we're lifting a name. We're restoring something sacred, not just for my father, but for this whole town, for the version of Cedar Hill that believes in decency again. The choir began to sing, no instruments, just voices rising together in a slow, harmonious wave. Amazing Grace, a hymn his father once led with eyes closed, hands open as if catching light. Daniel walked out into the yard as the congregation followed. The new headstone gleamed beneath the sun. Its inscription read, Reverend Thomas James Bennett, 1948 to 1977, a shepherd silenced, a voice restored. Rachel Carter stepped beside Daniel, her hand gently resting on his shoulder. He'd be proud of you, she said softly. I hope so, Daniel replied. I hope he knows I didn't give up. You didn't just find the truth, she said. You made people listen to it. That night, Daniel stood alone in the sanctuary, packing the last of the boxes. Tomorrow he would return to Chicago. He wasn't meant to stay in Cedar Hill, not forever. But he knew now that his father's story wasn't buried anymore. It lived on in the people who had shown up, in the windows repaired, in the silence that had been broken. Before locking up, he knelt once at the altar, not in prayer but in gratitude. And when he stood again, he left behind the Bible, his father's Bible, on the podium, open to Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God? As he stepped outside, the wind caught the edge of his coat. For a moment, he thought he heard a familiar voice, soft, encouraging, almost amused, carry through the air. Welcome home, son, Daniel smiled. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. In the weeks that followed, Cedar Hill began to change. The church hosted town forums for the first time in years. Young people returned. Granger, awaiting sentencing, wrote letters of apology published in the local paper. Charles Whitaker's trial was scheduled for the fall, but no one waited on court dates anymore to feel peace. They had found it in the truth. Eli was offered a seat on the church board. Rachel Carter, now quietly attending Sunday services, found herself walking into the sanctuary each week with something lighter in her step. And somewhere in the back row, a little girl held her mother's hand and whispered, "Who was Reverend Bennett?" The answer came with a smile, the bravest man this church ever knew. And Daniel, he returned to his small counseling practice in Chicago, but his sermons no longer lived only in a building. They lived in conversations, in second chances, in people who learned that the past could be confronted and healed. Have you ever forgiven someone who didn't deserve it and found freedom in doing so? Share your story in the comments. If this story moved you, comment yes below. Thanks for watching. Sorry for the interruption, but we hope you will help us improve our content in the future.